Looks like we have a good amount of people here. Looks like we can go on ahead and get started. I will turn it over to our director.
Good evening. I just wanted to do some little
This is the interpreter speaking. I'm sorry, I cannot hear you. Well, you're muted.
Oh, okay. It switched me off. Good evening. I just wanted to give you a couple little housekeeping. First, if you can all mute your mics when you're not speaking, that is super helpful. If you need accommodations, if you have an interpreter, please pin your interpreter so that you can always see them on the screen. Further, what will happen is when people are talking, they tend to come to the front of the screen or will be seen the most. And then when they are not talking and someone else is talking, the next person should come up. So if you can't see everybody all the time, it's not that we're not here. But you can go up into the line across the top of your screen and you can see where there's a gallery and then there's a large gallery. You can click on the large gallery if you want to see more people. Thank you, Chair Cumberland, for that. So, hi, good evening. My name is Val Jensen. I'm the director of the Department of Human Rights and Equal Economic Opportunity here at the city. I began in this role in January, and my first year has not even come up yet, but as COVID has impacted everyone, it's impacted our department as well. You're here for the Police Civilian Review Internal Affairs Review Commission. And this is our annual summit. And tonight you're going to get to hear from community members, most importantly, our commissioners. We also have several city employees that are here, as well as leadership. I believe I saw Chief Axtell. We also have people from the Department of Human Rights. HERO's mission, where PCIARC sits, is to serve St. Paul residents and businesses by advancing justice and equity through advocacy and enforcement. In HERO sits the human rights investigations and labor standards investigations. Also sits procurement and contract compliance. And what that means is that we investigate complaints of discrimination in both housing and in employment. We also are responsible for enforcement of the city's new Earn Sick and Safe Time and our new minimum wage. And we are very fortunate to be able to be working with really great employees and really committed people who want to do the work that human rights is designed to do. And what that is to serve our residents in a way that's meaningful, in a way where we have put the resident at the center of the work that we do. Also within the Department of Human Rights is the Mayor's Advisory Committee on Aging, the Mayor's Advisory Committee on Disabilities. We also have the HERO Commission, and we will have a new Labor Standards Education Committee, which will be starting soon here in November. Last but not least, we have PCIARC. And PCIARC, I'm very honored to work with, and we're very honored to hear from the commissioners and hopefully you in the community. I realize that we are in, sadly, another time in the history of our city, our state, and our nation where Black, Brown, Asian, LGBTQI, and those with disabilities do not always feel safe. And so our role as residents, employees, I believe mothers and fathers, sons and daughters, is to pay attention, to speak our truths, and to support one another as never before. As someone who's born in St. Paul and has lived in Minnesota my whole life, I realize that we are on a very long journey. And sadly, we are at a time in our history where we are all dealing with the stresses of COVID, economic burdens, as well as just feeling like we may be voiceless as we're sitting in our living rooms at a virtual summit. So I'm excited for you to hear next from our chair, Sierra Cumberland. And I believe that her messages will resonate with all of you. And then later on, we'll hear from our mayor and hopefully hear from you as well. So thank you for coming tonight. It really is important that you're here, and we hope to have a robust conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Val. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to join us and learn a bit more about the St. Paul Police Civilian Internal Affairs Review Commission this evening. We refer to our commission fondly as the PCIARC, and so you will likely be hearing that term throughout the rest of our program. My name is Sierra Cumberland, and I live in Ward 5, a proud resident of the North End here in St. Paul, and I'm the current chair of the PCIARC. I'll now ask my fellow commissioners to introduce themselves and give the St. Paul ward or neighborhood that they live in. If the technology works as we'd like it to, you'll be able to see each of their faces.
Hi, everybody. My name is Travis Grundy. I am the vice chair of the PCIARC, and I am from Ward 7.
Right. Are the other commissioners able to unmute their mics and introduce themselves as well?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Stefan Landro-Vellinga. I am from Ward 2, just moved from Ward 1.
Hi, everyone. I'm Commissioner Jilla Nadimi, and I live in Ward 4.
Hey, I'm Commissioner Charles Ganine. I also live in Ward 4 in the Midway neighborhood.
Everyone, good evening. My name is Eric Forstrom, and I live in Ward 4 also.
Right. Thanks, all. So as we begin our program, I'd like to acknowledge the pain our community is in as a result of inequities widened by the COVID-19 health emergency, as well as a result of the unnecessary deaths of individuals like Mr. George Floyd at the hands of law enforcement. We stand by St. Paul Police Chief Axtell when he described Mr. Floyd's death as a tragedy in every sense of the word. Chief Axtell addressed the widely circulated video of Mr. Floyd's final moments with his officers, saying, "I know the job is difficult. I know that the vast majority of the time, officers do what is right. But I also know that if we don't check ourselves, we run the risk of losing touch with humanity, and then we have lost everything." The pain our community is feeling cannot be healed by the police or our systems of government alone. Here in St. Paul, when one of our neighbors is in need, we lend a hand. When our community is hurting, we must do the same by supporting each other. It is the goal of the PCIARC to assist the St. Paul Police Department in maintaining high standards of officer conduct by providing civilian oversight of the complaint review process and by making policy recommendations. You will learn more about this work from our coordinator, Julian, in a few moments. The St. Paul Police Department has been a national leader of policy improvements in many ways. In recent years, the department has reformed their use of force policy, shifting to de-escalation, soft hand tactics, and less lethal force. The St. Paul Blueprint for Safety has improved the way officers respond to instances of domestic violence, moving towards a more victim-centered approach. The introduction of body-worn cameras creates records of officer interactions with the public for later review. As commissioners, we review footage from these body-worn cameras each month, and so have watched St. Paul police officers handling some of the most difficult situations with professionalism and respect on many occasions. However, there is still much progress to be made. The PCIARC makes advisory recommendations to Chief Axtell who we depend upon to be responsive to the community in his decisions. We call on Chief Axtell to hold all officers accountable for their conduct and continue making the department's operations more transparent to the public. We call on City Council and Mayor Carter to meaningfully consider community input when making policy and budgetary decisions that affect our public safety. We also call on you, friends and neighbors, to file a complaint when you experience or are a witness to police misconduct. We ask you to raise your voices and join us in advocating for continuing improvements to policy and how our systems of power respond to community members in the most critical moments. Again, we thank you for joining us and hope that the following presentations are informative and thought-provoking. We will have a panel to answer some of your questions near the end of our program this evening, but please know that we are open to your comments and concerns at any time. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Julian Roby. I am the coordinator for the Police Civilian Internal Affairs Review Commission. I am going to now tell you about our process as well as go through our annual report, which details summary data for over the course of 2019. So beginning with our process with complaint intake. So complaint community members or civilians can have an interaction that may be unbecoming with a police officer, and they may decide that they want to file a complaint. There are a number of routes in which you can do that. You can go to one of our complaint intake centers, which are available on our webpage. You can submit a complaint online. You can also come into the HERO department and meet with me and file a complaint. Once your complaint is completed, meaning that it has a name and a signature on it, I'll review it for completeness and send it over to the Internal Affairs Unit to begin their investigation. Once that's done, you will receive an intake letter from me informing you that the complaint has been received, it's been processed, and has gone to Internal Affairs for the investigation, and that this process should take anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks before your complaint case would come before the commission for a review. Once that's done, Internal Affairs will review that complaint case for its completeness, conduct their investigation, which they likely will contact the complainant over the course of the 8 to 12 weeks. Once their investigation is complete, they will then notify they will then place these complaint cases, load them up onto a virtual desktop interface, which is where our commissioners will have 2 weeks to prepare for a review meeting in order to deliberate on these complaint cases. Leading up to that, you will receive a intake letter again. I'm sorry, you receive another letter from myself, as well as the officers in the alleged complaints, notifying you that your complaint case is up for review. You have an option to provide a statement to the commission if you would like. Please note that this statement is completely voluntary. You are not required to make a statement. Your complaint case will be reviewed if you choose not to, or if you do. In the event that you do choose to make a complaint, you do choose to make a statement. However, your complaint case will be tabled at that meeting in order for it to be transcribed and being brought back before the commission to review and deliberate on your complaint case. So once the cases are loaded onto the virtual desktop interface, the commission has 2 weeks to prepare. The commission, after those 2 weeks, will meet at various locations across the city of St. Paul. Our next meeting will be at the Union Depot in downtown St. Paul. These meetings are open to the public, in which we have a public portion where community members can learn about our process, as well as ask questions that are regarding public data and just upcoming events that the PCIARC may be holding or participating in. Once that public portion is closed, we'll go into our closed door portion where complainants will have an opportunity to provide their statement. If they choose not to, the commission will then review these complaint cases and vote on the disposition, as well as, if necessary, disciplinary action or policy changes they would like to institute. Once they have completed their deliberations, I will write up a memo detailing those recommendations, deliver that directly to the chief of police. Once the chief receives our recommendation, the chief has the final say what should decision-making power, what should happen in in the complaint case. In the event that the chief disagrees with the recommendation, the chief notifies myself, who then notifies the court, the chair, and they have 5 business days to meet and come to some to discuss the disagreement, why the chief is disagreeing, and the chair's responsibility is to argue on the explain the rationale behind the commission's recommendation. Once that is happened, if discipline is imposed, the officer may appeal. If not, also they may go through a grievance process. If not, the complainant then receives a final letter notifying if discipline is imposed, what that discipline was. If not, that their complaint case is closed. We then track all of that data in our annual report, which I will get to in 1 second. So next I will go into our 2019 annual report. So in 2019, the PCIARC saw an increase in reviewed cases, total allegations, involved officers. The complaint classifications included excessive force, discrimination, improper procedure, improper conduct, and poor public relations. Of those, the majority of the complaint cases were classified as improper procedure. As you can see on our screen, majority of those complaint cases were improper procedure. The PCIARC reviewed 44 cases involving 72 officers with 52 allegations and 88 total allegations. In those 52 allegations, and just so we have an understanding of what the difference between allegations and total allegations are, a complaint case can have numerous different allegations in which of those 52. So for instance, say complainant involving improper procedure, but there's 4 different officers. So that would have 4 different allegations of improper procedure, and it would just be marked as 1 allegation for allegations, but total 4 allegations. That's where the difference in those numbers are. The PCIARC then, as I mentioned during their deliberations, they vote on the dispositions, what should happen in those complaint cases. The following dispositions are available to the commission. Included are unfounded, exonerated, not sustained, sustained, and policy failure. The definitions of those are on your screen. In the case of a tie vote, the complainant case goes directly to the chief of police without a recommendation from the commission. The largest share of disposition recommendations for the complaint cases were unfounded and sustained. Once a complaint if a complaint case is voted to be sustained, the commission then recommends a disciplinary action. When a complaint of the following disciplinary actions are available to the commission in those sustained complaint cases: oral reprimand, written reprimand, suspension, termination, supervisory counsel. These can all be coupled with the recommendation of retraining. Retraining, however, cannot be a standalone recommendation for discipline. Of the available disciplinary recommendations, termination was recommended the most in 2019 for the commission. Additionally, the PCIARC reviews firearm cases that have a separate disposition, which are justified and not justified, as well as the type of firearm complaint cases is tracked in our annual data. In 2019, the PCIARC did not view or review any firearm cases. Finally, the commission tracks how many times the chief disagrees with the commission. In 2019, the chief modified the recommendation of the commission 7 times. Finally, of the 71 complaints, 28 of those complaints came through our HERO department. Here is a breakdown of the demographic data on those complaints received in HERO. We like to point out that we're seeing some discrepancies in the age as well as race makeup of the type of complaints we're seeing, which will inform some of our future events moving forward, which we'll talk about a little later in our program. Next, I would like to introduce our accessibility coordinator, TJ Middlebrook, who will give a presentation on invisible disabilities, a response to the police communication sticker program.
Hi there. Good evening, everyone. Julian, thank you so much for including me. Wow, those stats are amazing. I feel like I've learned so much. Before we continue, I did want to let you know that Don't watch the interpreter. Please watch me. The interpreter is just interpreting what I'm saying. I will be communicating everything to you. So if you could just continue to watch me, that'd be great. Thank you. So let me kind of expand about what the disabilities and what we are here for. So there are several different ways that we have been strategizing and talking about invisible disabilities. And I am deaf, hard of hearing. And so when you look at me, there's no obvious apparent disability. But before we go into that, I do want to expand a little bit about my role in the city. I focus on providing equal access to different programs and services that are available to the residents, and also to provide training to staff, and then how to provide effective communication and access to that communication. Also, one of the roles I have as part of the advisory committee to see that programs provide equity. Like if someone can't provide an ID, we try to make sure that all the programs are accessible for all of our residents here in St. Paul. Also, I work with emergency services, providing access for communication, a wide variety of activities, again, all relating to access for everyone. And the reason that I focus on that, the population of the city is like 1 out of 5 of its residents have a disability. And some of those are invisible disabilities, the things that we cannot see quite easily. And invisible disabilities, it just means that this person has a disability, but it's not obvious. Like I use my example of myself. I don't wear hearing aids. It's not apparent. Other people, when they meet me on occasion, you know, if they walk with a walker or a cane, but then there's some don't. They might have a disability that you can't see. And so we need to be sure that we're providing services that match that. And for folks that have, you know, maybe an invisible disability does include mental health issues. And there are folks that we want to make sure that we're including. My PowerPoint disappeared. Hold on just a second. So again, we have 500,000 people that live here, and they that have a disability. There's like 364,000 people that live in St. Paul that have disability. That's a lot. And sometimes that population gets forgotten. You know, again, disabilities affect 1 out of 5 Americans. So again, that's a startling statistic, 1 out of 5. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we've talked about the folks that have disabilities, and that affects a lot of people. You know, then there are friends that seem fine, but they might not. Again, they might have different things that they're struggling with. And how can we provide access for the police, or, you know, the goal with safety in mind? Next slide. Access for emergency services. So the police department, they have policies, and we've been, you know, working with their policies to provide access. And one, we've identified, you know, if the folks that have an invisible disability, like you're seeing on the slide here, that sticker can be placed somewhere in the front, like maybe even on a car, or there's a wide variety. So whatever would be a good fit. And the reason why that we've developed those and given them to the police department, so then maybe when the police are called for an emergency and they recognize one of those stickers, they know how to approach the situation to provide safety. And, you know, maybe there's an issue that comes up, and the best way to respond might be guided by some of these identifying stickers, you know. And then we provide training on occasion to how to work with those different populations. We also use those stickers for if people recognize it and they're not the police, but like perhaps they're having somebody come to their house to deliver things or whatever, and they can see that sticker, and then it just increases the safety for those folks. So say if you're going through a drive-through and you park and the person is deaf and they didn't order at the order radio, but they come up directly to the window, you know, and then they come to order food, you know, it's not only for police, but those stickers have a benefit for a lot of folks that interact with anyone with those disabilities. Next slide, please. So again, the sticker program, it so helps people like recognize and then further discuss those invisible disabilities out in the community. You might be seeing more of these stickers. So often these things get overlooked and, you know, they didn't see. It's not a obvious disability. And again, specifically for the police department with the stickers, we help provide training and ongoing training for them, because many of the disabilities, it's not just one group, there's a wide variety. And so we help the police understand how to approach the different folks within those categories, and also to encourage them to continue training and continue learning different strategies. The goal for this is to help everyone understand that they can, you know, really be safe in this community. It helps the police protect themselves for if there's a cognitive disability, or again, a wide variety of issues they encounter. And the goal isn't just for the resident, but it is also for the police and for other employees, and the list goes on. I believe that this will help reduce some of the dangerous situations between the different groups, the police and whoever it is they're trying to serve that might have a disability. Next slide. Like I said, it's helpful for the community. It has a positive effect, and it starts dialogue between folks that maybe didn't have a conversation before. Again, this is not strictly for the police department, but it's for everyone to help keep our community safe and accessible. And it also allows us to feel less oppressed. Oftentimes, if folks with disabilities, if they feel ignored or overlooked because it's not obvious. And so again, these help recognize those disabilities and help them become somewhat visible. That's important too, so that they are not overlooked in our community. Next slide. Thank you so much.
All right. Looks like we're a little ahead of schedule right now. However, I also would like to mention that I mentioned during my presentation on the process and the annual report that are in Hero. You can submit complaints I should mention that during COVID, our Hero office is actually closed, but we are available via email. If you have a complaint case and you want that information, I'm more than willing to send that out to you. And you are also welcome to submit a complaint online. If you go to the PCIARC webpage, that information is available to you. So yeah, as I mentioned, we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but let's see.
While we have a moment, Julian, I just wanted to take a second to highlight. So as we mentioned previously, the PCIARC has the ability to make policy recommendations. And one of the policies that we reviewed within the last year was the accessibility policy. And so the accessibility policy impacts how officers respond to folks that may need reasonable accommodations, such as a second language interpreter, or sign language interpreter, or any other type of reasonable accommodation. So TJ was an expert that we were able to call in, and he was able to review that policy with us and give us his opinion, as well as just general recommendations for how the St. Paul Police Department could make that a more stable policy and improve officer responses to all community members. As TJ mentioned, there is a large percentage of the St. Paul community that does have a disability. And regardless of disability, every community member here in St. Paul has the right to be treated with respect and receive a high level of services. So I just wanted to highlight some of the great work that TJ has been doing, in addition to the introduction of this really exciting new sticker policy. Thank you, TJ and Julian.
Yes, thank you, TJ, for that presentation. Thank you, Chair Cumberland. In the meantime, seems like we're having some technical difficulties.
Hi, Julian. I think what would be best is maybe if we started with to talk, or if you went back and if anyone had questions about the annual report. We kind of went through that rather quickly, and I don't know if there's any discussion about it. I know there's been a couple questions in the chat about the annual report, so I don't know if we want to go back and just review a little bit of that data again. Otherwise, we could move forward and begin the kind of broader discussions that we had planned for the evening until the mayor gets on.
Certainly. And I can look at some of the questions that were submitted in the chat. Okay, so Sylvia Shores asked, what is your sense of how many complaints do not get filed? Do people feel empowered to file complaints in most situations? So to answer that question, I would state that we have, yeah, that's a tough one. My goal is to really inform the public as much as possible about this process, and not necessarily encourage. Encourage may not be the best word, but really just inform them that there's a process available to them, and if they feel as though that they have had a negative encounter with St. Paul police officer, that they can file a complaint with us, and that this group of civilians will review this complaint case and they'll make a recommendation to the chief of police. And this is an independent board that is making a recommendation on their behalf, and their community members just like you who care very much how they're interacting with law enforcement. As far as like how many people feel empowered to do that, I don't have an answer to that. My goal is to really understand what would allow people to feel more empowered and do that, and really hope to make people comfortable with filing complaints. So that would be my answer to that question.
And I also wanted to add to what Coordinator Roby is saying, that we also have complaint intake centers across the city. So it's the goal of the PCIARC to make folks feel more comfortable filing complaints if they experience or are a witness to police misconduct. They don't need to go down to 367 Grove and file a complaint at headquarters, St. Paul Police Department headquarters. They can sit down with someone like Julian or another community member at one of our complaint intake centers, rather than reporting directly to a police officer. So it is our goal to make this process as accessible and as open as possible to all community members, so that they can feel more comfortable coming forward and that we can work together to improve these systems of power within our city.
So there's another question. Can you give an example of complaints that may fall under the category of improper procedure? Yeah, so the PCIARC, when they're reviewing these complaint cases, they're basing their recommendations for dispositions on the St. Paul Police Department policy manual, and they are reviewing whatever the policy is in context of what the complaint case is, as well as what the evidence that they're reviewing in which the alleged officer did. And that if it seems to violate a policy within the manual, it would typically fall under improper procedure. Unfortunately, for the PCIARC, they don't make the classification when they receive the complaint cases on the virtual desktop interface. The classification is already given to them. They're just making a recommendation on what the disposition and, if necessary, a disciplinary action needed. But that's a very good question. The next question I'm seeing is, how do you file a data request? That is going to be dependent upon who are you filing a data request with. So you can file you can file a data request with HERO. You can also go to the St. Paul Police Department and file a data request. You just need to, and this is from Cornelius Brown. Cornelius, I can give you a better answer if I look more into that, what the specific process for filing that data request is, but you would go to the specific department in which you would need to file that data request. Mariana Giovanni asked, of the 8 terminations recommended by the commission, how many of those officers were terminated? Are the reasons given in each case why the commissioner's recommendations are not followed? So to answer that question, we cannot talk about specific complaint cases. However, if you are interested in finding out about specific officers, you can go to the St. Paul Police Department and ask for individual officers on public file. Are there reasons given in each case why the commissioner's recommendations are not followed? That would be a conversation that happens between the chief and the chair, in which the chair's, again, responsibility is to explain the rationale on why the commission is recommending that change and come to some agreement or understanding, like why there's a disagreement there. And sometimes the chief has his reasons for why he's disagreeing. The chair has their reasons for what the commission's recommendation is. Jay Wilkinson asks, decisions are based on what level of proof? So typically the commission makes their recommendation based upon the preponderance of evidence, in which more likely than not it happened, rather than yeah, that would be the answer to that. And Director Jensen has actually placed a link to departments for filing those data practices requests. So Mr. Cornelius Brown, you can click that link and that has that information that you may be looking for. Thank you, Director Jensen.
Julian, do any of the commissioners want to comment on any of the questions in the chat?
Just to elaborate on Julian's response about, reasons given in each case why the commission's recommendations are not followed. Yes, anytime that Chief Axtell disagrees with a recommendation made by the PCIARC, he does issue me a letter that outlines his full reasoning as to why he has chosen to disagree. I then have the opportunity, as Julian mentioned, I have 5 days to review that information. I am also able to access a recording of the PCIARC's deliberation of that case. So then I can listen back through the comments and the arguments that myself and my fellow commissioners were making, and as well as kind of refresh myself on the rationale as to why it is that we came to that decision. I also respond to Chief Axtell's disagreements with specific, if there's specific policy from the department manual that applies, I will include that as well, or in my recap of the PCIARC's rationale. Depending on the complaint, I will either send an email with my response. I also have the ability to call Chief Axtell, and on certain occasions we do meet in person, though of course we're minimizing in-person meetings as much as possible due to COVID-19 currently. And Chief Extel will also sometimes receive an opinion from the city attorney's office to include that with his disagreement letter. So that provides a little bit more of an understanding or a little bit more information as to why it is that he has decided to disagree with a PCIARC recommendation.
So Cornelius Brown asked, but ultimately the chief has final say as to the disciplinary action. If that's true, then does that mean that the issue is closed? Regarding for the PCIARC, yes, the chief has the final say in what should happen in the complaint case. How are complainants responding to the process and results? Jay Wilkinson. How are complainants? I'm actually not sure what the complainants responding to the process and the results.
If I may.
Sure.
Yes. I think that Jay Wilkinson is wondering, because we do send a letter to complainants once the case file has been closed. And, the PCIARC's information is on that letter. So I guess I'm kind of curious about that too. Julian, do you receive response or do you ever receive calls or responses from complainants once they've received that final letter that their complaint case is closed?
Yes, I occasionally receive feedback from complainants regarding their complaint case, in which sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's not so positive, depending upon the outcome of the complaint case, in which I explain to them that the commission makes a recommendation, and that's what it is. That's the extent of it's a recommendation, and that the chief has the final say in what should happen in the outcome of the complaint case. So it depends on, it's going to depend upon the complainant and what the outcome of that complaint case is. And sometimes we receive more positive feedback, sometimes negative feedback is.
And also to add to that, the PCIARC's recommendations are confidential. So if a complainant were to call Julian and say they were upset with the outcome, then Julian wouldn't even be able to say, this is what the PCIARC recommended, or, well, the PCIARC recommended X, but the chief ultimately decided Y. That is confidential information. We're not able to discuss any specific cases or even tell the complainant what the PCIARC's recommendation was, due to the confidentiality of the data that we review.
Katie Schultz asks, can you speak more to the time frame that passes 8 to 12 weeks from the time a complaint is submitted to when it is actually discussed by the PCIARC? So what happens in that time frame? You submit your complaint, it's reviewed by me and it goes to internal affairs. During that 8 to 12 weeks, internal affairs does an investigation in which they'll usually call the complainant as well as the alleged officers and sit down and meet with them, collect statements, as well as collect any evidence such as body-worn camera footage, in-car camera footage, any other video evidence, contact witnesses, to really get develop a case in which they try and determine like what actually happened. And once that usually takes about an average 8 to 12 weeks. Once that's completed, the internal affairs will make their recommendation, and then they will submit these complaint case files with all this information that they viewed minus their recommendation and submit that to the PCIARC, which they will review and make a recommendation that goes directly to the chief, independent of internal affairs unit's recommendation.
And the reason that it takes so long is that these investigations are thorough. Like I will read a complaint and think, oh, this is going to be fairly straightforward, but the investigative report will still be like, I've received some investigative reports that are 35 to up to nearly 300 pages. And some complaints will also have hours upon hours of body-worn camera footage available. So it takes a long time for internal affairs to really process all of that information and do a full investigation. I'd also like to mention that per the ordinance, the PCIARC does have the ability to subpoena witnesses or request the collection of additional information as we see fit. So really, we are reviewing the internal affairs internal affairs investigation of the complaint. And so the PCIARC does have the ability to request those additional pieces of information as needed.
So someone asked, what are your goals for informing the public that the process exists and the role of the PCIARC, especially in our communities that historically do not report? I will let Vice Chair Grundy answer that question.
Hi. The biggest reason that we want to inform the public is that the public doesn't report as much as we know that they probably should or could. And the more that they know the process exists, the more comfortable they can be with the process itself, with the thoroughness of the process, and feel more comfortable with moving forward and communicating when they feel wronged. Or when they feel like the police didn't maybe do a fully above board job, or when they feel like they just didn't have the best interaction with the police. And it's really about holding the police accountable and having a reasonably transparent process of that. So that's really the main goal, I think.
Hi, this is Director Jensen. So one of the things that Julian hasn't mentioned yet is that the PCIARC did receive a grant. I believe it's from the St. Paul Foundation, and that grant is to do outreach and education specifically targeted at youth, because that is a group that does not report and doesn't, I believe, have the trust that we want them to have in reporting. And so Julian is working on, with the changes going on with COVID, working on some virtual outreach opportunities as we are in HERO throughout the department. But this is obviously a big issue, and outreach and education is the key for us to be able to increase awareness around the work that PCIARC does. Just the name alone is difficult. You know, we have a ton of acronyms in the city. HERO Department, PCIARC, HERO Commission. There's a lot of information out there. And so one of the things that the department will be working on, and obviously PCIARC will be working on, is trying to make sure that people are aware of the work that the commission does and that the department does. The other thing that is important is the mayor's office, and I know that PCIARC will be part of this, PCIARC's leadership and commissioners, is putting together really a commission on to further look at community first public safety. And community first public safety is looking at things outside of just picking up the phone and calling 911 and having a police officer show up. What are some of the other community resources that we have? There's programs. I've been sitting in on community first public safety meetings. We've got Healing Streets. We've got other community-based organizations that are assisting the police department and the city in doing work that can help to build that trust with relationships. So that's going to be something that we need to do ongoing and to build upon. Even during COVID, I think it's even more critical now. So those are some of the types of things that PCIARC is doing, but also that HERO is doing as a department.
Awesome. So Carrie Sheldon asked, I'm not understanding how the business with PCIARC continues. I filled out an application a long time ago, but with COVID-19, how is the commission working on issues? So that's a very good question. We're still meeting. One second. You gotta mute yours. Sorry, echo. So we're still meeting in person. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, our next meeting will be next Wednesday, October 7th at Union Depot, where we'll have a public portion, which will share information that's available or pertinent to the PCIARC that's publicly available, such as upcoming events like our youth summit, as well as like any hero updates that are information that's pertinent to the public. Uh, so we are still allowed to meet, and those meetings are socially distant. So we ensure that like people are safe, and if they want to participate and receive this information. And the upcoming meetings and events are available on the PCIARC webpage if anyone is interested. If you just go online and you'll see all of our upcoming events, times, agendas, and what's happening.
Okay, I believe that Mayor Carter has now joined us. Mayor, are you actually in the audience now? Yes or no? Maybe I didn't. Yeah. Mayor, are you there?
He was here, but I'm not seeing him on the list any longer.
Okay. Well, we'll just continue the conversation. But I'm just going to introduce him so that when he does come on, Mayor, please unmute your mic and put on your video if you can hear me and begin. Mayor Carter became mayor of St. Paul in an election on November 7th, 2017. He won the mayoral race with 50.86% of the vote. Mayor Carter has lived in St. Paul all of his life and was also on the city council for the city of St. Paul. For me, as someone who works for the mayor, it is truly an honor to be part of his leadership team. And I believe that the vision that he has for the city is impactful, meaningful, things like community first public safety, things like guaranteed income. All of these initiatives are critical for the vitality and the success of our city moving forward. So thank you for joining us, Mayor Carter. Please feel free to address the audience.
Thank you all very much. It's really helpful to be able to be here, and I appreciate all of your work for our community. You know, I always say that it takes all of us working to build a city to work for all of us. And this body is certainly an example of that. As we think about the centricity of our national conversation around race, as we think about the intersection of crises that we're in as a country right now, it is race, it is culture of policing, it is economics, it is public health, it's all these things. And the incendiary moment that we find ourselves in right now very much is centered around the relationship between police and community members. More specifically, the relationship of between police and community members right here in the Twin Cities metro area. As we know, the entire planet stopped and held our collective breath as we watched that horrifying video of George Floyd being murdered at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department. We've seen, I think, over the course of these past few months, some of the worst examples of policing possible. The video of George Floyd being killed, the video of a 75-year-old man being pushed over and receiving a brain injury. We've seen some really horrific policing. Right here in St. Paul, we've actually seen some pretty good policing too. We've seen our officers partner. We've seen our officers kneel in front of the governor's residence. We've seen our officers partner with protesters to usher peaceful protests in front of the Capitol, in front of the governor's residence, along University Avenue, along the freeway, and a number of different places. I think this, and then we've seen nationwide a spike in shots fired in violent crime that has, in particular, communities of color calling 911 right now. More than ever before. And what this points to, I think, is a paradox. You know, and I share with folks, it's not anti-police to say that first responders are critical for our community. that when shots are fired or when someone is down or when some crisis happens, we need those officers. We need them available and ready to go, ready to run to us. And our lives are literally on the line, depending on it not being Officer Derek Chauvin who responds to us. All that to say is, I want to share with you that this conversation around policing, this conversation even broader than policing around public safety, because one of the things you'll continue to hear from me is the need to decouple uh, emergency response from public safety. We have pretended the two are one and the same thing in America for far too long. When we pretend they're the same thing, what we're saying is the best we can do. The best we can do is to show up as fast as possible after something terrible happens. We had a homicide last month, in the last few weeks, that occurred at a home that had something like 170 some 911 calls in the last 12 months. When we can look at one home, one address that has 172, whatever it is, 911 calls in the last 12 months and say the best thing we can come up with is when we have the 173rd call to just get there as fast as possible. That's an error in judgment. That's a flaw in strategy. And our perspective is we can do a whole lot better than this. We're in a challenging moment budget-wise. I want to acknowledge that. I hope you've seen our budget proposal, which centers around what I call the 3 zeros, a zero property tax increase, which is important because there's none of our taxpayers, residents or businesses that can shoulder an additional financial burden right now. Zero staff layoffs, which is important because our community members are relying on our frontline staff more than ever today. And zero use of the city's emergency reserves, which is important because that's our rainy day fund, right? And as much as it's raining today, it hasn't stopped raining. So the reason we are not going to tap that emergency fund right now is so that we can leave ourselves some room and flexibility to be ready and to adapt to situations as they continue to evolve. Getting this budget, getting those 3 zeros, I'm sure you can imagine in the context of a year where we had to cut $20 million from our budget, was very, very challenging. And it's going to require us to manage vacancies and attrition very aggressively across the city. It'll result in all of our city departments, including Hero, feeling understaffed and challenged to meet the needs of the kind of snowballing work that we have in front of us. But the goal was, this is a community, this is a climate, this is an economy that involves an enormous amount of pain. And we wanted to take that pain and pull it into our city's spreadsheets as much as we could to prevent from passing it forward to our taxpayers, to the people who are relying on our frontline services, to our employees, or to our children by foreclosing on our ability to be prepared to kind of build for the future. And build for the future we are. Some of the areas in which we're going to continue to be unapologetically aggressive is serving our unsheltered homeless population. We have taken about $23 million that we received, 23.5 from the federal government for COVID-19 response, and identified almost half of it, about $11 million, just to help with our approach to serving individuals who have experienced unsheltered homelessness. In this economy right now, we literally have an unsheltered homeless population in St. Paul that's literally more than 10 times larger than it was just this time a year ago. That's a major crisis for us. That's something that we have to respond to. I talk about equity a lot as this, if you think about like in a private sector, if I own equity in a company, that means I own a share of ownership, which comes with two things. It means I can participate in the decision-making process. That's why we do our community-based hiring processes to name our cabinet. That's why we do the budget engagement series to figure out kind of to develop the city's budget. That's why we centered our administration around public engagement. But then the second piece is participation in an economy. If I own equity in a company and that company has a great quarter, I have a great quarter too. That is broken where our national economy is concerned, which is why we've seen record-breaking stock returns and billionaire wealth grow, while literally every single person I know is desperate and struggling for air, financially speaking. And so another area that we're going to push, I hope you've seen a guaranteed income trial that we have launched, that we're in the process of launching right now. That'll identify a cohort of 150 low-income families with very young children who are participants in our College Bound St. Paul program to receive a $500 unconditional monthly benefit over the course of 18 months. We're going to do this with a national research team to conduct an independent third-party evaluation to determine what the impacts are on that family, that child, and our local economy. That I'm very excited about. Happy to take any questions. But then the third piece is continuing this, and this is something that we're going to need to engage you on directly, continuing to evolve our community first public safety framework, which I know you are aware of. Our goal, and I'm going to name a task force very soon to help us kind of guide us through this thought process. But our goal is to evolve that into kind of a 4-phase strategy. The first is emergency response. We do need emergency response. We need emergency responders who know our community, who are invested in our future, who know where the community centers are and where the pastors are, and how to like operate in community in a respectful way. So we need our first responders. We need them to be able to be focused on violent crime, responding to and preventing violent crime, and playing basketball with our children, right? The kind of proactive community outreach that, frankly, the St. Paul Police Department does pretty well. In order to allow them to focus on those things, because when we look at it deeply into our data, we see that literally 2/3 of our 911 calls, when people call 911, our police department categorizes them as either emergency, urgent, or routine. And 2/3 of the incoming 911 calls we receive are in that routine bracket. So in order to free our police officers to focus on violent crime and public engagement, we need to come up with a construct that says we can identify, and by the way, our officers tell us all the time, you've heard them, that they're called upon to be so much more than police officers, but social workers and mental health counselors and housing counselors, et cetera. So our goal is going to be to support our officers with the resource that they said they need. The housing counselors, the mental health providers, the chemical health counselors, et cetera, the social workers, et cetera, to be sort of an alternative response to 911 calls that are nonviolent, non-criminal, an alternative response so that we can respond with hopefully a more direct level of resource that meets the need, that gets there potentially quicker, and that frankly costs maybe a little bit less. And the construct is if we can chip off a piece of 911 calls that we can respond to with these alternative 911 responders, then we can take the savings there and use them to fund long-term the type of evidence-based crime reduction initiatives that we focused through last year's Community First Public Safety Framework. Those are the first three. The fourth is sort of environmental transformation. You show me a block or a neighborhood or intersection that we're worried may experience violent crime soon. I'll show you one we probably haven't invested in sufficiently from a public level. So our goal is going to be to identify what I call our highest potential neighborhoods and identify them as places where we need to go first to make sure the trees are trimmed and the street lights are quality and the street realm is well maintained and clean, et cetera, that when we build housing and when we build economic opportunity, that we're focusing those types of public investments in these areas to make sure that we are actually proactively keeping them safe. The whole kind of construct is like, we are not going to build a public safety framework that just waits until after something terrible has happened. We are going to build a public safety framework that invests and intervenes to reduce the likelihood that something terrible will happen in the first place. That's something that I'm committed to. So that's the kind of broad look at our budget. As you know well, my budget proposal is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of a conversation, because there are so many variables still to play out here in this year's budget. We don't know what the pandemic is going to do. We don't know what the economy is going to do, et cetera. That's as much the case this year as it ever is. And so, we'll need you to kind of speak up. I will tell you, the St. Paul Police Department, we approached in the same way as every other department. I took every reduction that I could while avoiding staff layoffs. And frankly, the reduction that the police department sustains in this budget proposal as a percentage or even as a dollar amount does not meet up with the percentages that, frankly, our libraries, our recreation centers, our fire department, and many of our other departments. On a percentage basis, it's probably one of our lowest reductions. We, in order to get there, had to delay or postpone 2 police academies. But I'll tell you, even in that sense, the controversy around this that people are bringing us is ultimately that we can't, reduce 1 penny or 1 officer or from our $125 million budget for the police department. So whether you agree with that or whether you disagree with that, we need you plugging into this process. We need you speaking up and engaging your city council member and engaging me and letting me know how I can provide a caliber of leadership that adequately and accurately reflects your interests, values, and needs for us. So thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of walk you through some of this. Certainly a whole lot more to come on this community first public safety framework evolution. That is the big bet for me. That is the big thing for me. That is the centerpiece of our work as we're going to be moving forward. So we'll be talking to you much, much more about that, but I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, Mayor Carter. This is Sierra. I'm the chair of the PCIARC. Thank you so much for your time this evening. It's a joy to see you and a pleasure to hear from you. So as you're working through this Community First Public Safety Framework, I'm curious about what role you envision civilian oversight and boards like the PCIARC having in that framework.
I think the civilian oversight is going to continue to be very critical. The work that you guys do is going to be really critical to, and particular to our that emergency responder space, right? Like we know that one of the things that we saw, and our officers know this. I was talking to a couple of officers after George Floyd was murdered, and one of the officers said, "Look, like I signed up for a dangerous job. I know that, but like I didn't really sign up to get hurt or attacked because somebody's mad about something that some other officer did in some other city in some other jurisdiction, right?" And so our ability to show people that no matter what you see on YouTube, no matter what you see on Twitter and Facebook, no matter what you see on the evening news, that in St. Paul, we hold ourselves to a really high standard of behavior and of accountability when our own behavior fails to meet our standards is going to be a centerpiece, a critical centerpiece for our ability to do really any of this work because, that having those first responders who we know that we can trust, we know that we can depend on when we see them is very critical. The trust, and this is what I was saying, we saw this summer undeniably, the trust that takes an eternity to build can be destroyed in an instant by someone else. And so our work of building trust is never done, and trust can never be built in the dark. And so I see the PCIARC as a body that helps make sure that we're turning on the lights and we're telling folks we can, and I say this about our police department, I am confident enough in our police department to turn on the lights and to show everybody what's going on and to be very transparent and to be accountable, to hold ourselves accountable when and if something happens that falls below our standards. I would say, and I've mentioned this to this body before, I think that establishing the relationship that we'll need long-term for this body, I would love to see us, and I'm going to need to do this as a mayor. I think it would be powerful to do it through this body. I always say that, I tell you when there's something I don't like, particularly regarding our police department. And so I also have to tell you when there's something I do like. And I think one thing that I think will be powerful for this body to consider that I'd like you guys to think about considering is just as you are responsible and step to the plate to make sure that we hold ourselves responsible and we hold individual officers responsible when they do something we do not like. I think it's incumbent upon us to shine a light and to acknowledge when we see examples of officers do things that exhibit the type of policing services that we desire to have in our community. So whether that's an annual award or some type of commendation or a recognition when there's an officer who, I want us knowing when there's an officer who we've gotten a lot of complaints on. So that means I think we should also acknowledge when there's an officer we get a lot of community commendations from. And I think as we build the relationship between this body in particular and our police department, if this body is one that only comes around with a hammer, then I think the relationship will maybe always be strained. I think the type of approach that I just described could prove critical towards helping to build the kind of camaraderie and that trust, that two-way trust that really has to happen in order for the PCIARC to meet its mission at the highest level. So that's something I'd be interested to know. You don't owe me an answer right now to it because I'm just sort of shooting from the hip. But if you guys would put that on your agenda at some point in time and discuss that, it's something that, like I said, I need to implement at some point in time. I think it's most powerful if it comes through the same body that we send our kind of accountability conversations through.
Any more
Other
questions,
questions?
Mayor?
Cornelius
You have your
Brown.
hand up.
Hi, Mayor Carter. Thanks for joining. Quick question. When you speak about transparency and you think about trust, with the limitations on what information the PCIARC can give out to the community, specifics, they're limited on what they can give. And then secondly, I know there's not a great analogy, but in a situation where the community feels that they have not been policed properly for decades and decades, where would that trust come from? Because the community is the aggrieved party. So why would the aggrieved party have to reach across the table when they're the aggrieved party?
Look, Mr. Brown, I really appreciate the question. I'll tell you what my parents taught me growing up is that we got to look beyond blame, frankly, and look to solutions, look to responsibility. I stepped forward, and what you just described is maybe 65% of why I wanted to be the mayor in the first place. And I'll tell you, I've had experiences with police officers around the country and certainly around this city that I just can't accept for my children to have. And I would say that that's why. Because this is a past that I am insistent on changing with regard to our children. I don't, unfortunately, see on a national level, I don't see the same level of urgency that you and I have for changing this conversation, for changing these types of engagements, coming from anybody else but you or I. And I think that's why you and I have to start the conversation. And I mean all of you and I, not just you, Mr. Brown. And so this is that's why we're kind of committed to this conversation. I think you're absolutely right. If you walk down my block, the block I live in, there are people who know two things: that they need the police, because I live on a block that has shots fired. My wife and I have witnessed I don't know how many, probably half a dozen shots fired just outside our back window right here. The most recent was just this weekend. And when those shots are fired, we call 911. We know that we need somebody to be able to come and help us solve these challenges for us. And so we have people in our community who know that we need police officers at times, and who also know that we have problems with the way our relationship has played out historically. And so those are the two things that we have to figure out how to reconcile. And like I alluded to earlier, we know that the trust that takes a lifetime to build can be just broken in an instant. And it's incumbent upon our police department, but it's also incumbent upon all of us as concerned community members to identify every source that we can come up with, every chance that we can, to help build that trust forward. So that's why it's something that I'm committed to.
Any other questions for the mayor? Okay, seeing none.
Well,
Thank you. Oh,
Look, if not, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I always say speak now or speak next time, because this isn't, the last time I'll be here. To your point, we are going to be naming this task force soon. We'll definitely be engaging you in that process as the body that is responsible for civilian oversight of our police department. We'll definitely be engaging you guys in that process in some manner. I can't tell you exactly what that structure ends up looking like yet, but we are working feverishly to kind of structure that and kind of figure some of that stuff out. I can tell you from my perspective, I could take the rest of this meeting. I could literally take the entire rest of this meeting sharing with you my experiences with police officers, like I said before, in St. Paul, in Minnesota, and around the country. And that goes all the way up through and beyond my time as a city council member. And so, this is a conversation that I'm committed to. It's one we're not going to let go of. And it's one that is going to be, I was going to say a long-term storyline, but maybe the long-term storyline of my time in this office. So I look forward to continuing to count you guys as partners, and I appreciate all your work.
Thank you, Mark Carter. And I also look forward to working out some of the logistics of the recommendations that you made regarding our work. We've got a lot to get done, that's for sure. And thank you for your partnership.
Indeed.
Pass it now over to Coordinator Roby. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you, Chair Kamala.
All right. So now we'll go into our panel discussion. These are questions that we received online in the registration form. On our panel, we will have Chair Cumberland, Vice Chair Grundy, Coordinator Roby, myself, the Director of HERO, Director Jensen, as well as Accessibility Coordinator TJ Middlebrook, who you all heard from in his presentation earlier. So beginning with the first question. I'd like to know what types of complaints you receive, how you investigate, and what actions have been taken in the past year. I'll let Vice Chair Grundy answer that question.
And I just want to start because there were a couple of questions a little earlier in the chat that had kind of, and this includes, kind of asked, where did I see it? About how the PCIARC operates. And I know that we think of PCIARC as police oversight, but fundamentally we are part of an internal process. And so that kind of colors how everything that we do and everything we review progresses. In the past year, we've seen a lot of varied complaints. We've taken more of an active role in policy review and policy recommendation, as opposed to just receiving the complaints and deciding on them, because we're able to see patterns in complaints the more that we see them. We're able to see patterns if we see the same officer over and over again. So concerns related to that, those come up, we see them, and oftentimes the first thing I'm thinking is, is this a policy failure? Is there a way that we could have fixed this? And is there a way that this can, unfortunately, be a CYA? Can we fix this now, solve it, and move forward, to not have to deal with it again? Julian Coordinator Roby did a very good job of explaining what we had determined this year. So I would point you back to that data. But again, I would say taking a top-down view and about making sure that when we see problems that come up, that we're trying to nip them in the bud, that when we see continuous problems come up with the same officer, that we're escalating the level of discipline that we recommend, and that we're trying to be a good voice for the community at large.
Thank you, Vice Chair Grundy. The next question we have would be for Chair Cumberland. What impact have previous review cases had in making calculable changes to system police interaction with civilians?
So I would say that every disciplinary recommendation that the PCIARC makes to the chief of police has the potential to change police interactions with civilians. So each officer that has a complaint sustained against them receives retraining on the policy that they were found to have violated. And the complaint is also reported on their personnel record. So the PCIARC also reviews policy and makes recommendations from the civilian perspective, which is our goal to kind of bridge the civilian perspective and what we as St. Paul community members expect to see from our police officers, the police officers that share our community with us. So in my tenure on the PCIARC, we have reviewed the K-9 policy as well as the accessibility policy, which I've mentioned shortly after TJ Middlebrook's presentation about how he was so crucial in providing his insight to our policy recommendations. So yeah, our goal with that policy was really to reaffirm a civilian's right to meaningful language access and reasonable accommodations. Our work is ongoing and really and truly never ends because there are always going to be ways that we can improve policy and improve the way our systems respond to community members.
Thank you, Chair Cumberland. I can take the next question. Police training. This one asked about police training, mental health, and use of deadly force. So the PCIARC, as mentioned mentioned in the presentation, we have explicit authority to recommend policy changes for training, as well as we also have done some work in highlighting the work of the police department's Coast unit. At the 2019 annual summit, we actually highlighted that program, the mental health unit, and highlighted their program. And I would be remiss to mention that the police department does have designated resources for officers that are dealing with mental health and social well-being issues. The next question, I guess, will be for Director Jensen. What can the PCIARC do to stop St. Paul Police Department from over-policing, harassing, and killing of Black and Brown people? Also, how can we end qualified immunity for officers in St. Paul Police Department?
Hi, so thanks for the question, Julian. I just put in the chat a link to the National Association for Civilian Oversight. That is an organization that we belong to, and it really has, I attended their annual meeting last week, and it really has some amazing resources available. But to be honest and real about this, the work that needs to be done to end things like qualified immunity or to amend or change the protections that police have. In Minnesota, we are one of the states that has a state statute that basically dictates what PCIARC's role can be in civilian oversight. And so there's lots of different things that the community can do. One of those things would be to work with the legislature to amend that statute and to work closely with not only the city of St. Paul, but with the city of Minneapolis and at the state level to try to change the way that qualified immunity or in this case, the way that police officers have protections. While I agree that, the St. Paul Police Department has done some significant work, I also believe strongly that there needs to be community-based pressure and work to ensure that we are getting real, true police reform. And that's not going to happen just at the city level. It really does need to be a coordinated process. There's a couple different organizations. I'm not super familiar, but I know that they are listed also on the NACOL organization's website. But there is a organization here in Minneapolis, Communities Against Police Brutality. They are an organization that I believe is working on some of the police reforms. I have not personally worked with them, but there are different community-based organizations. I think you could also reach out to, organizations that have traditionally worked with communities. There's one of the organizations, even the NAACP, the urban leagues, the local, HAP, the Hmong American Partnership, working with even some of the Latinx community-based organizations. There are a host of organizations that are clearly working on and really dedicated to making sure that we look at policing, and that we don't let this time in history pass without taking a real in-depth look at how we're doing the policing that we're doing, and how we might be able to change that. Thanks, Julian.
No problem. The next question I will give to Chair Cumberland and Vice Chair Grundy. What is the procedure for examining patterns of complaints? What is the data regarding discriminatory complaints? And has the Chief of Police taken PCIARC's recommendations into account? How so?
Sarah, did you want to take that first, or?
Sure. Yeah, so as Coordinator Roby mentioned before, in 2019, there was only 7 times that the chief disagreed with the PCIARC's recommendation. So the Chief Axtell agrees with the PCIARC's recommendations the vast majority of the time. So examining patterns of complaints is an area that we are hoping to build upon. We on the commission, we are 9 civilian volunteers. And so our time with this work, as crucial as it is, unfortunately, is limited. And that is an area that we are hoping to expand onto. And so, yeah, I mentioned before the chief's the policy recommendations that the PCIARC has done, and that is work that is ongoing as well. In addition to formal policy recommendations, there are informal recommendations that we relay in every case deliberation meeting in our discussions with the internal affairs staff from the St. Paul Police Department that attends our meetings. Such as one recommendation was that, all sergeants, all investigators should record all phone calls. So that way we on the PCIARC are able to then review those interactions. And it's another layer of hopefully potentially protection for those officers if there's a complaint filed. Similar to what the body worn camera footage does, there is a clear record where we're able to see exactly what happened, rather than having to base our decision solely on hearsay. Travis, do you have anything else to add to that?
And I could add specifically, when it relates to something pretty heavy, like a use of force complaint, I can say, certainly for me in my process, I'm through the entire manual, and I'm going second by second in order to recreate the timeline that occurred, and sometimes when you're dealing with how it escalates and how it de-escalates, you can have a second here and a second there that really changes what that entire altercation scenario looks like. So it's a very detailed process. The last time we had one, I think it took me like 16 hours over 2 days to really chart that out, along with all the body, worn camera, because we had like a lot of people that were involved. So it's a process that takes a lot of time, and I can say pretty concretely that I am not the only person that has to kind of go in detailed like that in order to really ensure that I'm arriving at a reasonable conclusion, and that the conclusions we're arriving at they make sense with how we have to do oversight.
Thank you, Chair Cumberland and Vice Chair Grundy. The next question will be, does the PCIARC give the number of complaints against officers to the public? If the public wants to know that officers who patrol their community has a complaint, how do they get this information? Where do you find and file data requests? If the chief of police does not agree with the recommendation, what can the public do to have the chief's position reversed? Who creates the policies in which PCIARC uses to determine police officers' behavior inappropriate? So this question has been answered throughout the presentation, but I guess and it's also in the chat regarding the data request that Director Jensen provided the link to. If someone is interested in filing a data request, they can go through those proper channels. As far as I'll let Chair Cumberland address the meetings with the chief when there's a disagreement as far as like potentially changing or coming to some agreement on what all that entails.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we've mentioned, if the chief disagrees with a recommendation made by the PCIARC, then I get a letter, Julian gets the letter, and I review the PCIARC's deliberation of that case, and then I reframe the PCIARC's argument and present that to the chief of police, so that way we can have a discussion. And I have found it helpful to sit down with him and really discuss his reasonings as to why he made the recommendations that he did. Perhaps there's a precedent that the PCIARC was unaware of, or Chief Axtell has decades of experience in law enforcement and has his perspectives as well. And so it's really helpful to have an open line of communication, so that way we can both strive to understand the other side. There's a lot to unpack in this question, which I do appreciate. But it's asking who creates the policies in which the PCIARC uses to determine if a police officer's behavior was inappropriate. So, the St. Paul Police Department has their manual, and the St. Paul Police Department edits and updates their manual on a regular basis. But regarding the ordinances that actually govern the PCIARC, that's the St. Paul City Council. So, it is crucial that we are also in conversation with our elected leaders, so that we can continue to build upon the work of the PCIARC and continue making improvements to the ordinances and policies that direct police interactions with the public, as well as our systems overall.
And Sylvia, I'm seeing your question, you're kind of following on to that. How much influence does the police union have? And, they don't have any part of the process that we take part in. If they come into that process, it's after we've, given a recommendation, and the chief has also made his decision on how he's going to move forward with that particular case. So they're not sitting in the offices or sitting in the conference rooms. They're not in any of that process at any point in time.
However, I will add that the police union does represent officers through the arbitration process. So if an officer files an appeal or a grievance against a disciplinary measure that has been placed on their record that the chief has decided to place, then the police union would be involved at that point. It is also in the ordinance that, so the officers who the complaint was filed against, when the PCIARC has our meeting to review that case, the officer has the ability to come and speak before the commission, and they have the right to be accompanied by a union representative if they choose to come and speak with us.
Thank you, Chair Cumberland and Vice Chair Grundy. I think we'll take some additional questions from the audience if there are any.
A great point by Rajan. I'm really sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but the Teams format of the summit itself. And yes, we do hope to make future summits available online. Even if we have the actual summit in person, we do hope to also have an online component. I agree. It's great to be as accessible as possible and remove barriers like transportation, childcare, and tight schedules that can prevent folks from fully participating.
And to that point, Chair Cumberland, for Rajan, next week's meeting unfortunately will not be available on Teams. So yeah, we hope to one day, and that would require some changes to our ordinance. But as of right now, we're not allowed to have our meetings as streamed on Teams right now. But we do appreciate the comment and would like to make this more accessible, as accessible as possible.
Julian, I think it's important though that people can be part of the public part of the meeting in person still. They just cannot be part of the deliberations. So I think it would be great if we could have access via Teams for the public portion. And I think we're all working on that. But it's largely because of the ordinance and the sensitivity of the information that is being shared about employees of the city that we cannot do our meetings on Teams at this time.
Correct. Thank you for mentioning that, Director Jensen. And Cornelius Brown asked, if the PCIARC is not giving the names of officers, why is the recommendation considered private? The 8 termination reasons in the chief's position to oppose 7 of those recommendations. Mr. Brown, we're dealing with private data, private employee data, so we're not allowed to disclose that information. That's why we release summary data to showcase that, try and make this process as transparent as possible. And that's at both the state and local level. We're subject to data privacy laws, in which we're limited in what information we can share with the public.
Something that's not a question, but a very important point that I want to highlight. We are actively recruiting for the PCIARC right now. We do have 2 openings on our board currently, and so we'll put a link in the chat, but please do. You need to be a resident from the city of St. Paul and be able to pass a background check as well as participate in some trainings with us. But it is our goal to make the PCIARC as diverse as possible to better reflect the diversity of opinions of community members. So if you, your friends, anyone you know that would be interested in participating in the PCIARC, please do apply. We would love to have you join us.
I also want to put a plug in for the other boards as well. We have the Hero Commission and several of the other committees. And so while, and obviously PCIARC is a priority for us, I don't want people to feel like they can't have input into what the city is doing because they're concerned about a background check or concerned about the stringent requirements with PCIARC. There are opportunities to get involved in the city on our other boards and committees. So I think that if you are interested, please apply. And we are interested in having particularly people from the east side of St. Paul, people from the west side of St. Paul, some of the areas that we just don't have as high participation from residents. please, we are looking forward to diversifying our boards and committees, and the only way that we can do that is with your assistance.
All right. I'm not seeing any, doesn't say like we're seeing any more questions. So I guess we can go into the closeout and final remark. Oh, I'm sorry. One more question. Um, does anyone, this is from Cornelius Brown again, does anyone know the statute that the data from the PCR becomes private? I'm confused as the subject matter is discipline. What makes it private? So the private debt, that's determined, Mr. Brown, that's determined by the Minnesota State Data Privacy Act. Not using officers' names.
Well, all the officers have public profiles that you can request when you do a data request with the police department. And so anything that's been finalized would be in there. So if you have concerns about a specific officer, you can go through that process and see what their public profile looks like. Is that kind of the concern that you're asking for?
And Mr. Brown, we can I can definitely answer additional questions you may have. Like, you can please feel free to email me if the community feels that the police will help its officers who I trust. Yeah, Mr. Brown, why don't you email me, and then I can try and get some of those answers to you. And thank you for your participation. Seeing that we're not seeing any other questions, I think we can go into closeout and final remarks.
Hi, I just put the link to the government data practices statute. It's chapter 13, and it's pretty extensive, but that is what governs our ability to not only, you know, collect data, but who we collect the data on, how we keep the data, and then how it's released. So each department does have someone, and particularly with PCIARC and the HERO Commission, there's a lot of information that may be shared that's private data. So there's a training that the commission goes through every year on data practices, on data privacy practices. So I hope that's somewhat helpful. So I wanted to take an opportunity, Julian, I think that you were going to be, we were going to talk about the youth town hall that I believe you are going to be having around PCIARC and other issues. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Certainly. So as mentioned during showcasing the demographic data from the 2019 annual report, we have seen two distinct groups that we're not seeing many complaints from. So in response to that, in addition to the funding that we got from our grant from the the St. Paul Minnesota Foundation, we will be holding two additional meetings over the course of the next year. The first being the Youth Summit, in which we will be specifically targeting youth here in St. Paul in the Twin Cities metro area, really to not only inform them of our process, but gauge their interactions with law enforcement and collect community feedback on how the PCIARC can better serve them. That event will happen towards the end of November, beginning of December. So I would encourage each of you to subscribe to the PCIARC listserv. So once that information, the date is solidified, you'll be the first to know and get that information out to you so you can join and get as well as share it with your networks. The other group or event would be the limited English proficiency population here in St. Paul. We're also not seeing many complaints from that group. So in response to that, we'll be holding an additional summit specifically targeting those different groups and really trying to engage them. And we'll ensure to make that process as accessible, whether that be with translation interpretation services, and really try and collect their feedback and see like how we can better serve and the PCR can be a better partner to that group here in St. Paul. And I would like to say again, thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you for your engagement and your questions and your willingness to partner with us in this process. We really value this community feedback. We really value each of you. And we look forward to having you at at a future event or seeing you at the public portion of a PCIARC meeting.
Thank you all for joining us. Please, I do implore you to reach out to commissioners, reach out to the department, reach out to other community-based organizations with your concerns. The only way that change happens is if we hear from all levels of the community, meaning grassroots organizations, as well as not just our city employees. So thank you for joining us tonight. We look forward to engaging you further, and please try to stay warm in this blustery Wednesday night. Thanks. Bye.